You know, my lunch was produced using groundwater. The salad vegetables are grown locally, and soda ash is used in the glass in the wine bottle and also used in cement for this building. If I look down at Adelaide's urban landscape, I can see parks, gardens and schools, all of which use groundwater to irrigate their ovals and keeping our city looking beautiful. In my work as a hydrogeologist, I need to understand Adelaide's groundwater resources. We need to know how much there is, where it occurs and its quality, so that we can advise government and industry on the best uses of that water. Traditionally, we think of Adelaide receiving much of its water from the Murray and the reservoirs in our hills catchments. Yet down there on the Adelaide Plains, groundwater plays a major role in feeding our city, watering our gardens, sporting grounds and schools, and has been essential in establishing and driving industry. Groundwater is exactly that. It's water from under the ground, which is stored in aquifers. Aquifers are sediments and rocks which can hold and transmit water. The water flows through the tiny pore spaces in the sediment or rock, or in some aquifers through cracks and fractures. This flow is very slow, not the way rivers flow on the surface, but much slower. The aquifers in the Adelaide Plains are known as sedimentary aquifers. They were formed over time from the accumulation of sediments from marine deposits and ancient rivers. Aquifers are mostly filled or recharged through rainfall, which seeps down through the ground, but recharge may also occur from the base of creeks and streams to shallow aquifers, or leakage from aquifer to aquifer. Over to the east are the Mount Lofty Ranges, and this is the source of much of the groundwater that's found in the deeper sediments on the Adelaide Plains. The rain that falls on the ranges today infiltrates through the fractures in the rocks, down through the sediments and to the Gulf St Vincent. It takes about 17,000 years for a drop of water to make this journey. We access groundwater by drilling into an aquifer and drawing the water up via a pump. The Adelaide Plains have a number of aquifers. These date back in geological time 100 million years to periods known as the Quaternary and older Tertiary period. In one location, there may be several different aquifers occurring at various depths below the ground surface, each with a different water quality. Some of these aquifers have good quality, low salinity groundwater which can be used for irrigating sporting ovals or growing food. This water is quite brackish and can be used for road building or quarrying, but if it's treated to remove the salts, it can actually be used in pharmaceuticals or for food processing. So which aquifers do we use? The deeper aquifers, most commonly used by industry and for horticulture, are up to 100 metres below ground surface. We know them as the T1 and T2 aquifers. Between the Little Parra River and Waterloo Corner, the best quality water comes from the T1 aquifer, and this is used for growing food. The best quality water of the T2 aquifer, coincidentally, occurs as a ribbon beneath the Gawler River. As these aquifers extend further south, they become more saline, but the quality is suitable for irrigation of sporting and school ovals and use by industry. Other younger and shallower aquifers, such as found in the Quaternary sediments, are tapped into via backyard bores, mostly for watering gardens. In some areas, the shallow aquifers are connected to surface waters, such as rivers and dams. We saw an example of this when the Torrens Weir was inadvertently opened in 2009, draining the Torrens Lake. The lake quickly filled to a base level as a result of groundwater inflow. This interconnection between surface water and groundwater is important, as it can extend flows within the creeks and rivers into the drier months, where there is less rain, providing water for the environment and keeping animals and vegetation alive. Recently, many local councils have worked to re-establish wetlands as a way of naturally filtering stormwater. These wetlands may create their own connections between surface and groundwater, but we also get involved by deliberately injecting this treated water into aquifers for storage. The T2 aquifer has been the target for many of these projects, which aim to store water under the ground so it is available for later use. So even though you can't see it, groundwater plays an important part in Adelaide's landscape. Unfortunately, there's some signs that we're not using this resource sustainably. And if you'd like to know more about the condition of Adelaide's groundwater resources, please watch the next film in this series. After all, it took 17,000 years for the groundwater to get to us, and it's a very important resource for Adelaide.
Lesson 3, Water Underground. We want to know, how does water move underground? Water soaks into the ground through the pull of gravity. So anytime there's precipitation, the pull of gravity is going to pull water from the surface into the soil below it. Water underground trickles down between particles of soil and through cracks and spaces in layers of rock. Effects of different materials. Different types of rock and soil have different size spaces or pores between their particles. Thinking about the concrete out for the parking lot, there's really not very many cracks or empty spaces or pore spaces between the asphalt or the concrete that makes up our parking lots. So a lot of times when rain comes in contact with that area, the rain just simply runs off. It cannot be absorbed into the groundwater supply. Whereas things that are like our softball fields that are mostly just sand are going to absorb a large amount of water. A lot of that rainfall that lands on our softball fields is going to be absorbed into the groundwater supply because there's a lot of empty pore spaces between the molecules or the grains of sand. So the size of pores and the connections between them determines how easily water moves. If you have large empty pore spaces in a sediment, water is going to flow pretty easily through it. If there are very few pore spaces or cracks, it's not going to allow water to permeate through it as easily. Permeable materials. Materials like sand and gravel allow water to pass through or permeate very easily. This is part of the reason why when you build a house, a lot of time pea stone is added to the basement before concrete is put on top of it. And then a lot of times small gravel or pea stones are added around the outside of the house as well. That allows water to easily pass through that sediment and not end up in your basement. Impermeable materials. Some materials have few or no pores or cracks. Or it could be that the pore spaces are just very, very small. Because of that, water cannot easily move through that body of sediment. Clay is a perfect example of this. It has very small pore spaces, and so it doesn't allow water to permeate it very well. So the picture that you see here shows clay that has been rained on. Specifically, it's red clay. That red clay that's been rained on traps a lot of water on top of it because it does not let the water permeate through it very well. Water zones. Water from precipitation soaks down through layers of sediment. This picture represents that. So as precipitation hits the surface, it's going to flow down through the layers of sediment. Water will continue to infiltrate the ground until it reaches a layer of rock or sediment that is impermeable. So eventually we get down deep enough where we have clay or rock or sediment that helps to trap water on top of it. It won't permeate through it. The layer of groundwater, or the layer of ground, where water does not fill the pore spaces between sediment, is called the unsaturated zone. This is also known as the zone of aeration. So we've got this area right here where there's empty space between the rock particles But that empty space between the rock particles does not have water in it. Whereas we get down to this area where it's still going to be sediment, but between those sediments there are going to be a large amount of water that is held inside of the pore space. So this area where there is no water inside of the pore spaces of the sediment is called the unsaturated zone. The area where there is all the pore spaces are filled with water is called the saturated zone. The layer of the ground that has all of its pore spaces filled with water, again, is called the saturated zone. This top line of the saturated zone is called the water table. And in order for us to get a well that will actually allow us to draw water out of the ground, we have to put the well below the water table line. If we put the well below the water table line, then we can easily draw water up from the ground supply. The depth of the water table varies depending on a number of different things. It can be changed based on the seasons. It can be changed based on the roll or the shape of the surface up above the water. Specifically thinking about the seasons, we can have times of the year like the spring where we have a lot of precipitation. April showers brings May flowers, where we supply a lot of water to the groundwater supply. As we get closer to, say, August and September, a lot of times the groundwater supply is used up. A lot more plants are using up that water. We are pumping water out of the groundwater supply. And there's not as much that is being replenished into the groundwater supply just simply because there's not as much precipitation. There's not as much rain. Snow melting also will supply a large amount of groundwater or water to the groundwater supply. So we talked about the unsaturated zone, the water table, and the saturated zone. In this picture, it shows a well that's been drilled below the ground into the saturated zone. Typically, the saturated zone is very deep inside of Earth's surface. In Michigan, not quite as deep as other parts of our country. We get to other areas out west specifically where you have to dig a well much deeper in order to get to a groundwater supply. Whereas here in Michigan, you can dig wells 20, 30, 40 feet and you can get a groundwater supply without having to dig very much deeper than that. Sometimes the flow of water or the direction of the flow of water is changed by impermeable layers. Impermeable layers cause water to not be able to flow through the groundwater supply very easily. Because of that, it will flow to the path of least resistance. It'll move to a place where it flows the easiest. And so that may change the direction in which groundwater flows. So looking at this picture, which is the saturated zone and which is the unsaturated zone? Where are we going to find each one of them if the water table line is right here? What's the top one going to be? Is it going to be the saturated zone or the unsaturated zone? If the water table line is right there. The saturated zone, not going to be the saturated zone. It is going to be the unsaturated zone. Saturated means filled to capacity. So if it is filled to capacity, it's going to be everything that's below that water table line. So what is the top one going to be then? The unsaturated zone. So the unsaturated zone is everything above that water table line. Not very much water is going to be filled in the empty spaces between the sediment. Everything below that water table line makes up the saturated zone. And then also notice that there is a less permeable rock layer down here that won't let water transport further through it. So the water's really going to sit on top of this impermeable layer of rock. So how do we as people use groundwater? As was already mentioned, the water table in a given area may be only a few feet underneath the ground that you're standing on, or it could be hundreds of feet below you. If the water table reaches Earth's surface in any particular area, naturally, we call this a natural spring. And the picture represents that. This is an area where water is simply flowing right out of the ground. And a lot of times where this occurs, the water will eventually run down to some stream or some river and eventually flow out to a larger body of water. Aquifers. The underground layer of permeable rock or sediment that holds water and allows it to flow is called an aquifer. Aquifers have to have empty space between the rock particles for the water to fill, and there also has to be a connectedness between those particles, so the water can flow from one empty space to another empty space. So think about it like this. We've got our water table, and below the water table is the saturated zone. This can be much like making a parfait, or even when you go to 7-Eleven and you get like a slushie. Okay, and you stick the straw down in the slushie and you start drinking the fluid that's inside of there, right? And you're pulling it out through the straw. Okay, you're pulling the liquid up between the pore spaces, the empty spaces between ice particles, right? Because most of the slushy is a bunch of small little pieces of ice. The liquid itself is filling those empty spaces between the ice. And then there's little cracks and crevices that occur between the ice that allow water to be drawn up, or the liquid to be drawn up through the straw. Where you drink some of the liquid, more replaces that liquid by moving in from other surrounding areas. Aquifers work much the same way. Aquifers can be small or large. This picture shows the water table line below some sand. So somebody dug down a little ways and they hit water. The area where, or that line right at the top of the water would be the water table line. And if you were to draw some of that water out of that area, more would just come in and fill the empty space that you took by taking water out. Because sand allows water to flow very easily. Some aquifers can extend into many different states. The Ogallala Aquifer, for example, it lies beneath the plains of the Midwest from South Dakota all the way to Texas. So it is a very large aquifer that allows us to pull water out of the ground to supply people and industry with the water that they need. I know Ogallala is kind of a funny word, isn't it? It provides water for millions of people, crops, and livestock. So not only is it used for our drinking water supplies, it's also used to irrigate crops on fields. It's also used to irrigate lawns or fill swimming pools. Aquifers are not limited resources of water. Aquifers can run out of water. If we are pulling more water out of an aquifer than what we are replenishing it with, we end up lowering the water table line. If the water table line goes below a well, it creates what's called a dry well, where that well will no longer suck water up. Much like your Slurpee that you get from 7-Eleven during the summer. You suck all of the fluid out of it, and eventually all you do is start sucking up little chunks of ice, right? And you no longer get any of the fluid that's in it. So if we take more water from an aquifer than is replaced, then the level of water drops. So when we talk about using groundwater supplies, we'll talk a lot about conservation. And we'll talk a lot about the amount of water that we use with regard to the amount that goes back into the groundwater supply. Currently, California is having a very large drought. They have gone a very long time without much rain. That and the continual use of water causes the water table to decrease or go down in parts of California. Over time, people are going to find that wells run dry and they no longer can get the water supplies that they need for livestock, for crops, for using it as a shower or a drinking water source. So this is a picture of the Ogallala Aquifer. So this picture shows where it is found in parts of South Dakota and Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. The green represents areas where the saturated thickness is fairly low. The blue is much higher saturated thickness, so the blue is going to be a much deeper area for that aquifer. The green is going to be less deep. Movement in aquifers. Water does move underground. Not exactly like a river, but it does flow very slowly between pore spaces in rock.
So do you think there could be fish down there,
So the rate of movement depends on a number of different things, including the slope of the water table, the permeability of rocks, some water moves only a few centimeters per day. Groundwater may travel hundreds of kilometers and stay in an aquifer for thousands of years before coming to the surface again. So much of the water that we pull up through the ground through our wells, it is not put there within the last 5 or 6 days. Most of the water that we have has been underground for a very long period of time. Wells. The depth of water and the water table can vary greatly. We've kind of seen that previously. Generally, water tables follow the shape of the land surface. So you'll see on this picture where we've got a larger or higher area of the land surface, the water table's up a little bit. Whereas as we get over here to the lower areas, it's down a little bit lower. This picture shows an open well. It shows a dry well where there is no water coming out or filling the well itself. It shows an open hole well, a gravel packed well, and just a well that was dug by hand probably. Also notice that we have the sea out here. And we can end up with what is called brackish water or salty water that has a slightly saline or slightly salt taste to it. Because we're getting what's called saltwater intrusion, where the seawater is coming into the groundwater supply. And that's not good for us to drink, nor is it very good for us to water our crops with it. The level of the water table can rise during heavy rains or snow melts, and it can fall during drought periods. People can obtain groundwater from an aquifer by drilling a well below the water table line. Those of you that live out in rural areas, most of you have a well that was dug. Usually they bring in some very large equipment that digs basically a hole in the ground, kind of a cylindrical hole all the way down through the ground. And then they usually run some piping down it, and they put a pump at the bottom of it, and it just pumps water right up to your house. The pump is usually operated through electricity that's supplied within the house. If the bottom of the well extends into the saturated zone, then we can draw water out. Again, if it does not go into the saturated zone, then you won't be able to draw water out because there won't be water supplied to it. So the picture right here shows an aquifer. And with a little bit of your prior knowledge, we should see that there's a spring here. The area where the aquifer is a saturated zone. The area where there is no water in the groundwater supply is the unsaturated zone. The line right here would be the water table line. So where would a farmer want to drill a regular well? Want to drill it in the saturated zone. Very good. We have not talked about an artesian well yet, but an artesian well is one that allows water to just simply bubble up without the use of a pump. And usually it is due to an excess amount of pressure from overlying water or overlying caprock sitting on top of the aquifer. Where in here do you think you might find an artesian well, or where could a farmer drill and have an artesian well where pressure would be created due to overlying caprock? Brett? Okay, over here on the spring. Could be, maybe right below the spring. Maybe this area of rock is causing overlying pressure on the water table itself. But probably not a ton, because you'll notice there's a bunch of pore spaces that are not filled with water. So this is a saturated zone, an unsaturated zone rather, right underneath it. Any other guesses? Yeah, over here where the hills are. So we've got an impermeable layer sitting on top of an area where there's an aquifer, where water is in the ground, and then another impermeable layer underneath. So it's kind of creating a sandwich effect where the top layer is pushing on the aquifer itself. And so an artesian well could be drilled there where you would not have to add pressure to it. The water would, or add a pump to it, the pressure from the overlying rock would automatically cause water to come out. So your home probably uses a pump to build pressure to remove water for use. So your pump probably looks a little bit like this. This one's just simply an outdoors one. You probably have one in your basement that looks similar to this, unless you live in a town that supplies water to the residents. If you live in a rural area, it probably looks a little something like this, where you have a big bladder tank where pressure is increased and then the water's pumped out to the rest of your house. So if your pump removes water too fast, the water table may be lowered below your well, which causes a dry well. We do not want dry wells because it's very expensive to go have another one drilled. So right here we see a picture of a dry well where the well does not go all the way down into the groundwater supply, into the aquifer. This one right here is a heavily pumped well, and this creates a cone of depression. So as we're pumping more and more water out of the groundwater supply, the water table line kind of dips down in that area where you're pulling water out, mostly because water does not flow very fast underneath the ground. So you're pumping it out, and it's not replenishing itself or moving back into the area that you're pumping it out as fast as what you're taking it out. So as I already mentioned, if this occurs, you may have to dig a new well that is deeper to get water, or wait for rain to fill the aquifer again. I know some people that have a well that they operate for their farm, and they don't operate it a whole lot, but on occasion they use it to water their cows and stuff like that. And it's a well that it's very close to the water table line. So what happens is he turns his well on, he runs it, he supplies water to his cow troughs, and then if he runs it for an hour or two, it eventually runs out of water. And so he has to be very careful not to burn up his pump. If he waits a couple of days, then the water just replenishes itself. It moves back into that area, and he can pump more water out. But it takes some time for him to do that. So relying on pressure, artesian wells and springs are special. There's a picture of an artesian well. This was man-made. Here's another picture, an artist rendition of an artesian well. They only occur in locations where caprock sets on top of the aquifer, causing pressure to build. So we've got a layer of caprock right here, or an impermeable layer that's causing pressure. If we drill down below that caprock, the pressure comes out. It causes the water to just spout right out of the well. So when cracks or wells are put in the caprock, water rises on its own, creating an artesian spring. Here's a picture of an artesian spring. This is an area where water is just bubbling out of the ground, where there's a crack in the ground, and the pressure from the overlying rock causes the water to flow out. So the question is, what is the difference between an artesian spring and an artesian well? Difference between an artesian well and an artesian spring.
Spring is at the top of the thing. It's like the top of the ground.
Okay, a spring is at the top of an impermeable layer of rock. That is partially true, because we can also say that an artesian well is at the top of that impermeable layer, though. What's the difference between a well and a spring, maybe, is a good way to say that.
A well is something that is pumped out.
Okay, a well is something that is pumped out, so it had to be created by whom? Man. Wells are man-made, springs are naturally occurring. Anytime we talk about a spring, it's naturally occurring in nature. When we talk about a well, it's going to be man-made or man-dug. All right?